Okay, here's the lecture on Michel Foucault's Panopticism, a chapter of his book Discipline and Punish. Okay, panopticon, the idea of the panopticon or panopticism has become a really sort of commonplace idea in modern life. You'll definitely run across this term if you read anything. If you study computers or you work in sort of in IT or any of that kind of thing, you definitely will know about this. But we're all familiar with it because computers are the way in which surveillance um, is the most common these days. But that's not the only kind of surveillance that modern society has. One of the things that I want to do with this lecture is give you a little historical context, which Foucault was a philosopher, but he was also kind of wanted to look at things historically as well, um, and in fact was the founder of kind of literary theory as well as historical theory called New Historicism. It's an application of sort of historical concepts and the idea of contextualizing and understanding and questioning um, societal historical trends, where things are in a society, and understanding cultural products in that context. So it's important to know about that. And This concept of the panopticon or of panopticism starts about the same time as what we think of as modernity or the modern age starts, which is, this Bentham is more like 1700s. Modernity is maybe a little bit earlier than that, but it's definitely tied up with just before the Industrial Revolution, um, and there's definitely some connection there. So our modern world definitely is part of this culture. Um, this idea of surveillance and kind of watching each other is sort of integral to the culture according to Foucault. So let me get to the idea of the actual panopticon itself, and you have the slide here. The panopticon was a prison developed by Jeremy Bentham, who was a philosopher in the 18th century, in the 1700s. Um, it was considered a humane prison, actually. Most of the prisons were like dungeons, dark and dank, and, people were chained and all. You've seen that stuff in movies and that kind of thing. That was true. So the idea here was that it was a better, more humane sort of social, a way of dealing with incarceration, a way of dealing with um, people who needed to be punished and needed some sort of discipline and order. They needed to be observed. So one of the things that's important about the idea of panopticon, if you look at the word and break it down, pan means all, and optic means, it's the same as the word optical, has to do with being able to see something. So optics are, this physics study of lenses and, things that you can see through, and how light bends and all that kind of thing, how we see. And so panopticon just means all seeing. And so it's a really valuable word. It's something that we sometimes now think of as the idea of Big Brother, which actually comes from 1984, the book by George Orwell, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with because it gets taught in high school quite a bit. And it that concept is not the same as panopticon, but it is similar. It's very similar to it. And today we talk about this idea of surveillance, about being under surveillance. And as I said earlier, you can see where this is going with modern computers and in my face-to-face class we talked a little bit about this the other day. You go to look at, you're like shopping for something online, and then you go to look at your Google search engine thing will pop up an ad, or Facebook will pop up an ad that shows you what you were just looking at, right, to remind you that you wanted to buy that. And that's one kind of surveillance. But of course, there are others as well. There's government surveillance for crimes. which has been in the news quite a bit over the last 10 or so years at least, probably a little bit longer than that. And probably about 15 years, actually. It was in the Bush administration when there was stuff about the NSA kind of wiretapping and listening in on people's phone records and all that kind of thing, or looking at people's phone records and stuff. So this whole concept, anyway, comes out of Foucault. Kind of develops this whole concept around the idea of Bentham's panopticon model prison. What Foucault does is extend that idea into a larger concept and says, there's this societal sort of emphasis or need, perhaps, for there to be surveillance. Now, I need to make really clear here, Foucault does not say surveillance is good or surveillance is bad. He's just sort of identifying that this is something that's there and it's built into our society, and it's so deeply ingrained in our society we don't even think about it that much, is what he's trying to say. So as I go through the next few slides, I'm going to be sort of trying to talk through some of the subtler points of what he's trying to get at, and then we can kind of we're going to kind of end on the rhetorical triangle and the idea of from Comp 1 of that, that triangle of how a text is communicated, and that's something we're going to kind of come back to again and again this semester. So I'll end on that and kind of run through some of that with this particular essay. So that's where we're sort of headed with this. So let me move on to the next slide. Okay. So here we have the cost of a civil society is the question that we want to ask ourselves. Do we have to have surveillance in order to live in communities? There is an argument that could be made that yes, it is necessary. So let's think about this a little bit. So there are some trade-offs involved. If you live in a city or in a suburb or even in a small town, there are questions that need to be addressed. If you live near other people, there are questions about your own safety, other people's safety versus people's individual freedoms. Also, you can look at this in terms of employment. Employers are huge surveillors of our daily life. I mean, there are lots of places where people work where, how often do you get on to make a phone call to customer service, and what's the first thing they say before the person even comes on to talk to you? This call may be monitored for quality assurance, is what they say. But they're surveilling their employees to make sure that they're doing the job the way that they've been taught to do it, that they're on the phone the right amount of time. There's all sorts of things. If any of you work in a call center or ever done that kind of work, feel free to post on the discussion or on the weekly response and tell me more about it, because I haven't done that work, but I understand that there are some of those kinds of factors involved in it. But all employers have some kind of surveillance, even if it's just annual reviews. We don't get to just nobody's like a lone ranger, right? Nobody works all for themselves unless you're self-employed. And even then, there's government regulation, all that sort of thing. Why do we have all of these things? Because there's a built-in assumption that people need to be regulated, because if they are not regulated, that they will potentially devolve into bad behavior, right? So this can get out of hand, obviously, where people are being overly surveilled and, somebody's got their eye on you all the time. It can be a lot. And we sort of swing back and forth between less of that and more of that, sort of culturally and societally. Some workplaces are more that way. Some are less that way. Some, it just sort of changes. Governmental administrations, as we have new people go to Washington, there's a change in how much of that happens, based on, that government's sort of, that particular president's ideas about that, or that particular Congress's ideas about that. So it does switch back and forth. If there's pushback from the public, then sometimes they back off of it a little bit. So some of the ways, let me give you a couple of examples besides the workplace ones. I'm sort of on the other side. Here's a great example. One of the things that we feel as a trade-off in our lives are traffic laws. Okay, so when you're on the road, there's a speed limit, and the speed limit is posted at a particular amount. It may seem absurd to you that that's the speed limit. Maybe it's too slow. Maybe it's too fast. And we, often will see, a police officer sitting on the side of the road monitoring traffic, seeing who trying to catch speeders. We all are aware of this. Everybody's seen it, right? When you drive by that, you'll have an emotional reaction to that. You probably have an emotional reaction that's something like, "Oh, there's the cop. Let's be careful," or I better slow down, or maybe you're annoyed by it. Okay. But there are other times when you might be driving down that same road and, somebody's going well over the speed limit in a way that seems dangerous and reckless, right? Say the speed limit is 40 and somebody's going 60. You're like, you might say to yourself, where is the cop right now? Or, you might do this on the highway, especially where people speed a lot. I drive on 275 every day to get to Claremont, and, man, some days I swear the other day this was a lady behind me going 90. I mean, it was crazy. So, we have that trade-off of, on the one hand, we don't want these things, right? We begrudge them. We don't want to be surveilled. We don't want there to be these laws, people gripe about the law all the time, right? On the other hand, what would it be like if we didn't have any? What if there were no regulations about, how, I don't know, I'm having all this work done in my house because I had water damage earlier this year. What if there were no regulations about, work, like a code? Somebody could just come in and put in whatever in my house, and then it burns down. The electric is bad, or the pipes burst, which is kind of what we had happen, but not because of any regulation thing. It just was something else. Anyway, I won't get into all that, but in any case, there need to be some kind of rules and some protections for people, but then that impedes on someone else's rights. Okay, so, or does it? What are your rights in a society? This is a pertinent, relevant, important question for you to be asking yourself all the time in every context as a citizen. Everybody's gonna have different feelings. Some people are much more, libertarian and think we don't need hardly any laws at all, and other people will feel like we do need some to protect people. And it's just, there's just going to be a range there of different opinions. But it is something that needs to be, monitored and discussed and openly debated in a civil society at all times, it seems to me. Next question, or the next thing on here I have is this is an important sort of subpoint to this. There are different stakes if you are a person who is some kind of physically different person in particular, or some kind of minority. Outside of sort of the white male sort of dominant culture that we sort of still have. So, for example, regulation of bodies is part of surveillance. And it can be really, really scary for people who are of color. Witness all of the examples that we've seen over the last few years of, people recording, Black people being stopped for, minor traffic violations, or on the sidewalk for things, and then the ways in which that escalates really quickly sometimes. That idea of sort of an excessive sort of surveillance of people because of the way they look is one of the things that Foucault, he doesn't specifically talk about that, but people who do work with his theories definitely bring this in. This is a thing that is now, part of sort of, intellectual conversation about where we're at as a society. The same could be said for people who are LGBTQ. Those people also, their sexuality, their bodies are also surveilled and regulated. All of us are, right? Gender is something that is very much regulated by society. We'll talk more about that next time with Butler. But that's definitely part of what happens here too. There were laws against homosexuality, as I'm sure you're all aware. A lot of those laws have gone by the wayside in the United States. They still exist in other countries in some cases. In some countries they don't exist at all. But that's, there is a way in which that kind of surveillance, whether it's legal or whether it's, merely sort of neighbors or, people sort of talking or whatever, can be a threat, and it can be a danger. So there's a lot of sides. This is a very complex topic. It's a very complex idea. There's a lot of different aspects to it. So something to just kind of keep in your mind as you read this essay, and then as I said, when we read Judith Butler in the next week and go through that lecture, you're going to see more of that. Okay. I want to focus in now a little bit on the word discipline. The book being called Discipline and Punish. This is certainly part of what he is talking about with surveillance. Sort of the flip side of surveillance is discipline, right? So you'll sometimes hear people say, "Well, I don't care if people surveil me. If you're not doing something wrong, who cares?" Right? If I'm implying that I have self-discipline and I'm not breaking the law or whatever, so I don't have anything to hide, therefore I don't care if anyone's watching me. Okay, which is an interesting kind of take on things. Maybe a little simple, but I think the concept is a little more complex than that. But we do think about that a lot. One of the things that Americans pride themselves on is, at least in our sort of the mythology of what it means to be an American, is that Americans are self-disciplined, self-regulated. I see a lot of that when I read essays from students that, students are proud of the fact that they have sort of internalized, self-control and, learning to be organized, disciplined, structured, makes you a good worker, right? So these are the things, supposedly. So these are the things that we emphasize. School emphasizes this like crazy, right? Especially like high school, I would say, is all about sort of keeping everybody in a disciplined, orderly fashion, keeping you moving around, making sure that you're complying with all the rules and regulations, getting things in on time, all that kind of stuff. That's a part, I mean, in colleges too. But I think that's a really big part of the way that we socialize children. And it's one of those things that we expect, and it's all sort of geared toward work. To be a productive worker, you need to be able to do those things. And so for those people who that sort of thing doesn't come naturally or easily, or they just don't want to do it, they sometimes are bucking against that sort of system. And sometimes the people who want to feel that way but don't really have a natural ability toward it feel guilty about it, which is interesting. Another way that the word discipline is used is as a field of study or expertise. So a discipline, like we use it in academic settings, right? So English is a discipline, history is a discipline, business law, I guess, maybe is a discipline. I think it is. I think it's enough of a thing. I'm not sure if it's just a course or if you could major in business law. I don't know. Communications is a discipline. Biology is a discipline, etc. Okay, and so those are fields of study or fields of expertise. This is certainly the more traditional college subjects. Majors are all considered disciplines. And so why is there a connection between, why do we call it that? Because it's, related to that idea of self-regulation and self-discipline, that you study and you learn and you become expert in something requires a kind of self-discipline and focus, right? And a structure. And in fact, a discipline also has certain parameters and, people who are in the discipline understand what those parameters are. This is what we know right now. These are the prevailing theories. This is what we teach. This is what we operate under when we're doing research. These are the ideas that we have. So there's a kind of disciplining of thought involved in that as well as, of course, in the title of Foucault's book, the idea of sort of pairing it with punishing. If you're not disciplined, right, on your own, then you will be disciplined or punished, right? That's what elementary school does. That's what parents do. And there are other, of course, that's also what larger society does. If you speed, you get a ticket. If you, plagiarize a paper, you get busted for it, and it goes on your record in school, and you might get kicked out of school for it. There are all sorts of different aspects of how we look at this in our society, and there are plenty of rules that we have to follow, right? Not following the rules means that you may well be punished if you get caught, of course, as you know. And then what do all of these things have in common? They all have that idea of some kind of regulation, whether it's external societal regulation or it's internal regulation by yourself, that you regulate your own behavior. And so it's an interesting question to think about. What does it mean that we put such an emphasis on that? What does it imply about what we think of humans and their behavior, that we have so much focus on control, whether it's external control or internal control? It seems to me, and this is just my theory, and you can feel free to argue with me if you want to, it seems to me that it suggests a kind of a worldview that people would be left to their own devices. People would run amok and cause each other harm and be really greedy and rip each other off. And so it's a pretty negative view of sort of human, human nature, I guess I would call it, that implies that we need to all be regulated in this way. Okay, one of the things that Foucault sort of brings, it kind of comes up in the essay. It's not like a dominant point, but it comes up over and over again. Is the idea of record keeping, and record keeping as a kind of tool of oppression. So writing becomes a tool of oppression through the idea of record keeping, in part. So, for example, your permanent record in school, so they call it, right? Writing down infractions, writing reports. Like I said before, I talked a little bit earlier about, performance reviews. There are many of other kinds of things like that. So laws, clearly the laws are written. The earliest writing in the world is, legalistic. It's, writing down what the rules are. But there's all of this disciplinary reporting in addition to that. So police reports, report cards, behavioral reports of various kinds, patient charts, annual reviews at the workplace, spies write reports. Okay, those are just a few that I could think of. I'm sure there are many others as well. So it's curious to me, to think about this a little bit. And it's one of the things that Foucault does talk about here a little bit is the idea of without language, how would we report what we observe? So language then becomes a tool of oppression in a certain way. The ability to write something down. Writing is obviously a neutral thing. It can be positive, it can be negative, but it can have a negative function, and it is one of the tools of surveillance. There's a need to record things. Nowadays, of course, we also record things. We do audio recording, we do video recording, right? Nowadays, we have things like, like I was saying earlier, video, people shoot little video on their phones of people breaking the law, of people being mistreated, all sorts of stuff. And we tend to look at a video or audio as the truth, right? So what we see is true. And we believe in those things more than we tend to believe in the written word, because writing is it's considered more mediated. That means it's further away, from what actually happened. So, a person has to intervene in some way for writing to occur. That's true of video too. It's just not as noticeable that there's a person there videotaping something. We tend to really be persuaded by what we see in that way. So it's just something to think about. I'm not suggesting that it's better or worse, or that video is good or bad or anything of the kind. I'm just suggesting that there's just another tool that could be used for surveillance, right? I mean, think about video cameras that are in stores. They're video, right? The idea being that is, a really faithful record that is persuasive to a jury. If you, break into a store, that, you're the guy, right? Even though we know that sometimes people are wrongfully convicted, and sometimes even that sort of thing, it's not always, maybe somebody looks sort of like you, right? Maybe it didn't get a good angle. There's all sorts of ways in which that could be not very helpful, right? Okay. Finally, to move on to the rhetorical considerations. So I'm going to be focusing on this throughout most, if not all, of these lectures, this idea of the pieces of the rhetorical triangle, which were part of your Comp 1 studies, I'm sure, because everybody, I think, teaches it. And if they didn't, then okay, no problem. I'll definitely cover it. It's a really important thing to think about. It's sort of a way of stepping back from what an essay is saying to look at how it is built, how it is structured. So one of the things to look at is the topic or the message, which is the logos. So what is being said? What is this about? What is the essay about? What is it covering? Okay, and it's also the evidence, the argument, all that. So if you can read on the slide here some of the things that go along with the logos part. Okay, then I'm going to move down to the speaker writer, or the ethos. This is one that's really important, a really important part of understanding an essay. The building of credibility, which is the way that ethos is usually understood in classes, we talk a lot in the first year course, especially about building your ethos as a writer using, and we talk about, hey, if you use, you use good sources and you write carefully and you don't make, a lot of grammatical errors, that builds your credibility, right? I'm sure you've all heard this before. There is more to it than that. The speaker or the writer also has, brings with them a history, a context, a culture, their education, certain preoccupations, and all of those things are an important part of understanding an essay as well. We need to be careful about that because there's an idea where we sort of conflate the author with what he or she is saying and, suggest that they're always, the same as what they're writing, which isn't true. What I'm saying is that the writer will bring those things, those interests, but a good writer can also sort of separate themselves, and they're not always writing autobiographically. They're not always writing, with an axe to grind, so to speak. People can be neutral. They can be dispassionate about things. They can be, they can write about something that has nothing to do with them. But it's an important thing to think through, and we'll come back to that again and again during the semester. And then finally, the audience. Who is the audience? Who are the readers? This is where we usually focus the idea of pathos. This is the things that are listed here. Emotion is the one that's the most often kind of connected here with pathos. But really, it's about the thinking through what is the writer trying to convey to an audience. Every writer knows they have an audience, even if they're not writing for a specific individual audience. They always are writing to sort of a reader, right? Even if it's a generalized reader. And so it's important to think about that when you're reading, like, who is the intended audience here? Is it me as a college student? Was this written for me? The introduction that you guys read from Bartholomew and Petrosky from Ways of Reading, that was written to students. This is not written to students. I bet you can tell the difference, right? There's a difference in the tone of it. There's a difference in the language, right? Foucault is trying to get down ideas that strike him as important that he wanted to express that were, he's trying to work through like an intellectual problem. And the best way to do that sometimes is to write it out, especially if it's a complex problem. So he's writing it for, that purpose and to share it with others who are also interested in those ideas. And then I want you to also look here at the bottom of this particular slide, the idea of a couple of other things that don't make it into the rhetorical triangle. The idea of telos, which is, the sort of the purpose of the argument. Is it persuasive? Is it argumentative? Is it informative? Is it exploratory? Not everything we're going to read this semester is argumentative. And I would say that's, in fact, I don't know that anything we're going to read is argumentative. We stress that a lot in Comp 1. Learning how to argue is a very valuable skill for college, but it's not the only kind of writing that there is. And so we're going to be reading things that don't necessarily have a strong argument as their center, that are instead trying to explore an idea. For example, I think this essay is exploratory in many ways. It does make something of an argument, of a way of looking at things. But it's really, he's sort of exploring and sort of thinking through a complex idea and trying to kind of work through all the implications of that idea as he sees them. And then finally, the context. I've talked a little bit about this already, but the situation that surrounds the writing. What is going on? Sometimes you can know this, sometimes you can't. What is going on culturally at that time? That's something that would be interesting for further investigation. You might think about, when Foucault wrote this, what was happening. I mean, he wrote it in the mid-70s in France. Look at a little bit of French history and figure out what was happening then. Maybe there's a clue as to why this was an important essay in, 1975. So those are some things we'll continue to be kind of returning to every time we read essays in this class. I want you to kind of get to a place where it becomes, by the end of the semester, it becomes the way you read a text, is that in addition to reading it, you kind of step back from it and give yourself some time to think, okay, what did I just read, and what is it trying to do, and why is it, how is the author trying to arrive there? I think that's a really valuable skill, and that's where you really take your reading to the next level. Okay, that's all for this week.